Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. It's Saturday morning, and that's a perfect time to talk about nostalgia because I still watch cartoons every Saturday morning because I'm stunted in my mental growth, of course. But I've been encountering a lot of been encountering a lot of examples of the fallacy of nostalgia lately, and I think it's a really fascinating thing to talk about because it has a lot to do with just the basic mechanisms of how stories work, just generally. Um, I One of the ways to really understand the fallacy of nostalgia is to look at post-rationalization, which I think is one of the core causes of misunderstandings in the nature of how stories work. So you read a story, or any sort of art, really. You read a story, and it makes you feel certain things irrationally or rationally. It makes you feel certain things. And then after the fact, you try to figure out why it made you feel certain things. That's the post rationalization. So we come up with stories, the storytelling fallacy of stories. We come up with stories to explain why we feel a certain way. And that manifests in all of these different misconceptions of the basic mechanisms of storytelling. Um, so the fallacy of nostalgia, you like something, it must be good because it's like these things of old that I liked very much, or something is bad, I must dislike it because everything nowadays must be bad. There's so many different manifestations of that. There's so many different really big scale problems that really are rooted in that. Uh, I really want to just talk about mundane, frivolous things, of course. It's Saturday morning. I don't really love talking about politics anyway, especially not Saturday morning for whatever reason. But you can imagine how this applies for sure. Has serious um, political ramifications. Um, but um, there are two things I think that really help. Two examples that I think really help me understand just the mechanisms of the fallacy of nostalgia. Um, One of them is Saturday Night Live because which Saturday is an appropriate day for that. Another one is Room by Emma Donoghue, and the movie adaptation too is pretty close to the story. Both of them have one of them is kind of a silly, frivolous one. One of them is a very serious one, very dark, intense version of that. But if you look at just how people respond to Saturday Night Live, I've been watching Saturday Night Live pretty steadily since I was a child. My parents let me stay up. My mother was a social worker, but she let me watch some stuff most parents might have frowned on, and I heartily thank her for that. But I've been watching it pretty steadily, and my vivid memories of Hans and Franz. Let's say I think when I started watching it, Hans and Franz and the church lady were big things. So I've been watching it pretty much nonstop since then. But when you hear people talk about Saturday Night Live, they always talk about it in the same way. They say Saturday Night Live is bad right now, but it used to be great. And when you really pursue that, usually they'll name just probably something from they'll name something from 5 years ago or 10 years ago or something like that. It's the steady pattern that, let's say, 10 years ago, Saturday Night Live used to be magnificent. Uh, Now it's terrible. And I've seen pretty much every era. The 70s, Saturday Night Live used to come on Nick at Night, and I watched that pretty obsessively. So I've seen pretty much every era. Haven't seen all of the 80s stuff because if you really want to say when was Saturday Night Live genuinely bad, early 80s might be a good case for when it was genuinely bad, but still you had some of the sketches from that era still stand out as some of the all-time greats. The Eddie Murphy stuff, for example. If you look at the season Eddie Murphy was on, or the Martin Short season, or a handful of those seasons, they had some magnificent sketches. like the synchronized swimming sketch. That was in a rough period for Saturday Night Live. But it's an amazing sketch. I mean, pretty much every Eddie Murphy sketch, it's memorable. But that was a bad period for Saturday Night Live. So in my regular schedule watching it, um, one of the first times I experienced that was in the transition between the Dana Carvey, Mike Myers era and the Chris Farley, Adam Sandler, David Spade, that sort of era. There was a transition. It wasn't really a dramatic transition. It was sort of there's a lot of layering in there. And people would say, well, Saturday Night Live's terrible now. I miss Dana Carvey and Mike Myers and all of them. But this Adam Sandler and Chris Farley guy, they're terrible. They're just stand-up comedians, and they don't know how to do sketch comedy. They're just doing stand-up. That was kind of the complaint. Then the next era, people would say, when it was really good, it was when Adam Sandler and Chris Farley were on there. That's when it was really good. And that's just a constant cycle. But I watched all of them, and I, for whatever reason, I don't have the Saturday Night Live effect. I don't know what it is, but maybe it's just people come in and out. But Saturday Night Live, in the aggregate, has always been about the same mix of good and bad. I remember vividly there were sketches with Phil Hartman. Phil Hartman's amazing, one of the greatest of all time. But there were sketches when Phil Hartman was the lead character. I don't remember what the sketch was, but Phil Hartman was the lead character, and the script was well written. I remember consciously saying, "Well, this is a nicely written script. It's just not very funny." There were no laughs, and I remember there were tons of sketches at that time when, Chris Farley would be trying his hardest, and there were no laughs. But people remember, "I live in a van down by the river." I live in a van down by the river. Extremely funny. But sketches like that would be surrounded by, sketches with dead air. And I remember when Janine Garofalo came in, and a couple of other actors came in. That was to save the show. They saved the show from Adam Sandler and Chris Farley and David Spade and Rob Schneider. All of these people who, just in a few years after that, would be considered the greatest cast of all time, So, and that's the fallacy of nostalgia. That's a really sort of mundane version of the fallacy of nostalgia. As you're watching it, it's much more mundane and has a much wider variety of quality in the actual process of watching. Some sketches are great. Some sketches aren't. The bad sketches are usually forgettable. They fail to stimulate. They somewhere up here for whatever reason. The great sketches, the van down by the river as an example. All the Eddie Murphy sketches, the synchronized swimming, so many other sketches. Hans and Franz, when I was a kid, of course, Hans and Franz and the church lady. Those sketches stand out as amazing and memorable. But the bad ones are kind of just forgettable. So if you are watching Saturday Night Live just in real time, it's going to be consistently the quality it's always been. It's going to be, some are funny, some are not. But then you'll remember, wait a second. I remember Hans and Franz was hilarious. The church lady was hilarious. I mean, that also has something to do with growing old, getting closer to the death, time pressing on, entropy increasing with time. When I was young, I was happier. Doug Stanhope has a whole stand-up routine about this. It used to be great when I was a kid. No, it was great because you were a kid. It's not that the times were better; it's that you were better. You were healthier and happier and freer and didn't have responsibility. It has nothing to do with the universal existence of positivity or negativity. But it's that's the where the core value of any sort of story comes in. The story stimulates disregarding the positive negative duality. Sort of like last episode, my extremely popular last episode, or anytime when I talk about the hero's journey, I've talked about that a couple times, but just the basic, that's the really basic dynamic of the stimulation and destimulation, push and pull. You have the hero who's in a comfortable, familiar place that is homeostatic. It's not stimulating, but it's safe. That's not a good bad divide. Safe is great. Stimulating is great for a very different reason. You wouldn't, and then a monster comes along. You wouldn't say, I wish there would be a monster so that I have some sort of stimulation. You would say, I mean, in a real life scenario, you would want it to be boring and static and no monsters attacking. But if it's a story, it should be stimulating in some way. There should be some sort of danger. You wouldn't wish the danger on someone. But in order for a story to be stimulating and memorable and jump up in terms of your memory into something that is genuinely memorable, you need something like a monster attack. You need something really memorable. You need, in terms of comedy, it should be something really extremely embarrassing. Any of those sketches that I just mentioned. Why are they memorable? They're memorable because they're really embarrassing. Chris Farley's characters were really memorable, and Adam Sandler's characters on Saturday Night Live were really memorable because they were really embarrassing in some way. Synchronized swimming, perfect example. Really ridiculous and embarrassing. But that's an extreme feeling of embarrassment. It's kind of frivolous, of course, but it's an extreme feeling of embarrassment. But one thing I really love about Room by Emma Donoghue, which is a story that I still think about every once in a while. It still resonates with me. I mean, that's a sign. I mean, one of the signs of a great story. Still resonates me, and I still think about it. But one of the great things about it is normally when you have a story like that, a woman gets kidnapped and she gets held prisoner, and she raises her child entirely in captivity. She raises her child, Jack. I don't think she ever gets a name, if I remember correctly. But the kid gets a name. But the thing about... My dog is scratching. I'm talking about something very serious, and you're jingling your collar right now. Are you done? The dogs are going to start fighting. Right below the camera. I'm trying to talk about something serious. Hush. Hush. When I say hush, that they interpret that as an invitation to get crazier. Okay, let me try this. Let me move the camera so the crazy fighting dogs don't knock everything over. So anyway, she gets kidnapped. I'm trying to be serious. Hush. She gets kidnapped. Sorry. Okay, she gets kidnapped. And she has to raise her child in captivity. And so she makes up this whole little world for him, and it's really touching. I mean, and a story like that could very, very easily... my sideburns are so great. But a story like that could very easily slip into really tropey territory, where the drive is for her to escape her captivity, of course. I mean, that's the narrative drive. Obviously, she's in this terrible place. She's with this abusive captor. Old Nick, that's his name. She's with this abusive captor. The child is in danger. I mean, obviously, the drive is to you want her to escape. You want Jack to be safe, and so that's the stimulation of the story. But what Room does, which I think shakes it up from your sort of expectation. I mean, it could go in tropey places. I was about to say that. go in very tropey places. She could escape, and then she could have a fist fight with old Nick, and punch him out, and the police arrest him, and the family's around cheering and saying, welcome back, we love you, we're so glad that you're safe, we're so glad that Jack is safe. Oh, we didn't know. I think she had him in captivity. Certainly that's the heavy implication. But you have a kid now. They might have addressed that, and I'm blanking on that part of it. It's a very memorable story, but I'm blanking on that specific part of it, of course. So they don't really go in those tropey places. There's really no feeling of catharsis. Arguably, there's really no feeling of catharsis. The closest you get to catharsis, and I would say, if you want to see my feelings of catharsis, I've made some videos on that in the past, but there's really no catharsis in the sense that she defeats old Nick or Jack defeats old Nick or anything like that. He escapes. I mean, that's the closest you get to a climax, but that's really in the middle. The middle, or the 2/3 of the way in the book, and there's a whole section at the end, which is intense. It's an intense section. It's a complicated section. And this is one of the reasons it's haunting, is because certainly there's a triumph. They do escape, but that last third or so, I guess, of the book, she's tearing up something, and she's gonna make a lot of noise. Maggie, hush. I'm trying to do something serious. Here, let me hold this. Let me hold this. You can't tear that up while I'm doing a video. I'll give it to you in a second. Just wait. You gotta be patient. Be a good little girl and be patient, please. Be good, baby. Be good baby doggy. Be a good baby doggy. Okay. So anyway, she desperately wants the paper thing to tear up. So stop. The last third of the book and the last third of the movie third-ish, is really the mother trying to deal with the aftermath, and certainly her life isn't better, it's more mundane. And that's sort of the dynamic with any sort of story. The mundane versus the heightened danger, and going back to the mundane. It doesn't mean that the mundane is good, and I think Room definitely shows that. The mundane's just the end of the story. I mean, with classic triumphant heroic stories, it goes back to homeostasis. And, right at the end, there's a big celebration, just the really, really typical sort of heroic story. There's a big celebration. What Room does is, it's a joyful thing, certainly, that the mother and Jack have escaped. But it's much, much more complicated, because so much of it is really mundane. She still has a lot of her same problems that she had before she went into captivity. She still has this conflict with her mother. She still has all these other things that do not work out really well. And so the way it manifests in Jack is, arguably more complicated, because the only place he ever knew was that captivity. So in no way is it saying that the captivity was good, or that the captivity was better than the mundanity, but he's still drawn back. I think it was in a garage or something like that, where a shed. I can't even remember exactly what the space was, but he's a little kid, but he's drawn back to the shed. It was the world that he knew. It was this intimate place with his mother where he just made up all of these different stories. So you have the intensity of him experiencing the world outside of his captivity, but you also have the deeply complex intensity of this nostalgia he has for this place of captivity, where it refuses to simplify the dynamic of that post-trauma experience. And I think that's one of the complicated things about trauma, this is getting into the serious and potentially political stuff, of course, but that's one of the complicated things about trauma, for sure, is that we tend to... This is a dog who's experiencing some serious trauma. Oh no, I'm scratching your ears too much. Oh no, you're so unhappy right now, right? Happy dogs. Happy dogs. Really contrasting with this very serious conversation of about trauma. But I think that's one of the problems that we have in really considering trauma in the real world, for sure. But the role of trauma in a story, or the role of any sort of negative feelings in a story. I mean, even just a silly comedy, it's rooted in these negative feelings of embarrassment, or there's other things, of course, but it's rooted in these negative feelings of embarrassment, and we strive for the stimulation of embarrassment. What are you doing? No paper. God. Stop. Okay. No paper. Do not tear up any paper while I'm on camera. Okay. Where was I? Back to serious topics. So, we have this very dualistic perspective about traumatic experiences. Not that we would wish traumatic experiences onto people. That is absolutely not what I'm saying. But when we interpret traumatic experiences, we have this very dualistic sort of good-bad dynamic to it. When, in story form, the traumatic experience is stimulating. So we have this desire for stimulation, and we think of traumatic experiences as being very stimulating. So we have this retrospective perspective on traumatic experiences where we say that horrible thing that happened to me was very valuable. And so the post-rationalization, this is the argument. The post-rationalization then is framing it in linear terms, which I don't think is actually what's happening. But we tend to take this seemingly irrational perspective that looking back at this traumatic experience and saying this was a traumatic experience. I can't get it out of my head. I keep thinking about it. I'm really fixated on this traumatic experience. The dualistic perspective would say that it's purely bad. There is nothing that should be really appealing about it. And therefore, just dismiss it and focus on the good, which is the mundane. The mundane is not necessarily dualistically a pure good. The trauma, not saying I want anyone to ever experience trauma, but the trauma is not necessarily easy to pin as a dualistic universal bad, because people will look back on those traumatic experiences and they'll say, the way they frame it in a linear fashion is they'll say, I wouldn't want to experience it again, but I'm glad I experienced it because it helped me grow and it helped me learn. That can be valid, but I'm just, my perspective, from a narrative perspective, I wouldn't frame the traumatic experience. If we're thinking of a character, I wouldn't want to presume anything about real people, but if we're thinking about a character, I would not identify the value of the traumatic experience as something that they learned. That's an endpoint value. That's a linear value. I would identify the traumatic experience as the actual story, not the endpoint. The endpoint's not the story, but the traumatic experience is the actual story. And so, even though, Jack certainly from the dualistic good-bad perspective. What are you doing? Okay, get out. From a dualistic good-bad perspective. Stop. From a dualistic good-bad perspective. Trauma, universal bad, mundanity, supposedly universal good. From a narrative perspective, the trauma is the story. So if we really dismiss that as a universal evil, we would dismiss all stories, all stimulating stories. That being said, I wanted to relate all the episodes to going forward until I cover all of them to the Opal Beam War project that I'm working on. And I kept noticing all of these fallacy of nostalgia things just over and over again. Oh, another one was I've become addicted to videos of people watching Bohemian Rhapsody before the first time. People had never seen Bohemian Rhapsody or heard Bohemian Rhapsody. They watched the video. Um, and it's an amazingly joyful kind of experience, vicarious experience of experiencing Bohemian Rhapsody for the first time. Because it helps me experience it for the first time again. So that's part of the joy of it. But the interesting thing that maybe I'll make another video just about that aspect of it. Um, but the thing that they say at the end, which is strange and baffling, is they'll say that's what music used to be like, and that's when music was good. Music today is full of violence and sex and drug use. Bohemian Rhapsody has a line where he says, "Mama, I just killed a man, put a gun against his head, pulled the trigger, now he's dead." But then people will, at the end of it, they'll say that's so clean like music used to be. That clean as in the sound is clean, but clean also in saying, well, music today is so violent, which is demonstrably false. Even if you just look at Bohemian Rhapsody, it's a very violent song. But anyway, that's the fallacy of nostalgia popping up. The post-rationalization, looking back at music in the past and saying, music in the past was good. Not everything in the 70s and 80s was good. There was a lot of really bad music. But, looking at Bohemian Rhapsody, arguably one of the best songs of all time, and saying, see what music used to be like. It used to be really great. Well, I mean, you're taking the best example and saying it used to be great. But then a further post-rationalization and saying it used to be great because it was clean, and then here's what clean means. And if you look at the evidence closely, you can see, that's clearly false. But anyway, another silly example before I get into serious things again. But I have one story called Mother's Little Helper, which is about trauma. It's in some ways, sort of riffing on that same sort of thing that the room was working with, that sort of irrational responses to trauma that are valid to the experience of trauma, but not something you could easily dismiss as that good bad duality. And I have another story I'm working on now as part of my NaNoWriMo. My NaNoWriMo is four saints, and it has 4 different stories. And one of the saints is the Blessed and Multifoliate Marie Rose de Rocher. And in that story, there's each of the stories, one of the characters is connected to a saint, invisible saint in the sky by this golden tendril coming out of the back of their heads. I have this obsession with things coming out of the back of people's heads. I talked about that in my Hellbound Hellraiser 2 discussion, why that particular image obsesses me. But she was, because she had this connection to the saint, her family, set up this altar to her and bought her all these presents and what have you. She wants to escape that, and she desires mundanity. Once she gets mundanity, she has it's that kind of worship where they're keeping her trapped in her room and what have you. It's abusive, even though, on one level it seems like it's, they're giving her things and worshiping her. It seems positive, but it's definitely abusive. But she escapes that for mundanity, and she marries this really normal guy. But once she gets into mundanity, she has this nostalgia fallacy for the life she's always known, which is, being the center of worship. So it creates that complicated dynamic, where she was forced to be, to be still in this one spot, for her whole childhood. But once she gets out of it, that's the sort of life that she still gravitates to. So there's that. Mother's Little Helper is about, it's overt references to spousal abuse. And so that character, the whole idea of that one is that she has this magical entity who can grant any sort of wish that she has. So at the end of each day, she wishes to forget the day before, and she has this really abusive husband. She wishes to forget the day before, and they have a son. And so, at the end of each day, she contemplates, what could I wish for? Do I wish to kill the abusive husband? Do I wish, all these other things? And she decides, just start it all over again. Maybe it'll be better the next day. So that's that dynamic push-pull between a desire for familiarity and comfort and what have you, comfort and familiarity to eliminate the extremes of trauma and abuse and what have you. So in that story, I'm just getting outside of that sort of abusive bubble, and exploring, what are her responses after she's gotten outside of that abusive bubble. Sort of like The Room. Not The Room. The Room is a very different story. Just Room. Emma Donoghue's Room. But yeah, I mean that's based on true experiences. When you experience extreme physical trauma from someone who's a spouse, what sort of response do you have? Do you just leave, which is what you should do? I mean, in real life, it's what you should do. But do you just leave, or do you hold out hope that homeostasis will return? It's much more complicated. I mean, I could say, if you're abused, definitely leave. But I realize that the actual situation is exponentially more complicated than just that really dualistic perspective of, obviously here's the good and obviously here's the bad. And I think Room is one of the few stories that I've read, one of the few stories that really deals with that sort of complexity and deals really empathetically with a character who arguably doesn't have just a real easy decision to make. Once they get out, getting out doesn't make it necessarily any better. Makes it better in that they're not captive. I shouldn't say it doesn't make it any better. Doesn't make it purely good. Getting out of that doesn't make it purely good. There's still this huge amount of issues that they have to deal with, and the mundanity of being outside of captivity has a very different sort of emotional response, where for Jack, for example, his mundanity drives him into this sense of nostalgia, even though the nostalgia he has is for a very, very bad, inexcusably bad experience. It still drives him to this nostalgic appreciation of this life he used to have, this